So I ran Nortel's corporate business continuity program for 5 years. Some of you may have come across Nortel. It was, and sadly it was, a major telecoms manufacturer making equipment, 100,000 employees, and a third of the value of the Toronto Stock Exchange at its peak. So it was a very large company, very diverse types of business. Oh, and we're back. So I will click on to the one that I'm on. So very different types of business. My background, I moved into doing business continuity and technology resilience from a technology background. I'd originally started as a programmer doing data comms products, very much a make the systems work, went through technical architecture, and I think some of that's relevant for some of the messages that I think are important when we come to workplace and business continuity and business resilience. Nortel went into administration, which I touch on right at the end of my pack, and some of the reasons why that happened and the impact on continuity for that. And I'm currently providing consultancy services. If anyone has questions after today that they'd like to follow up with me, I'm very easy to find on LinkedIn because my name is not a very common one. So do feel free to contact me through that or through my email address. So a little bit of context for Nortel before I talk about the types of incident that happened. So it had 30,000 employees in about 50 different countries. The key countries obviously were Canada and the US. Significant operations in Europe. I was highly unusual actually being a global leader based in Europe, but for the purposes of working, many people had no idea where I was actually based because the job was whatever the time zone I was needed, I worked. So 2 a.m. conference calls with China were not uncommon, and I worked from home, so I had the flexibility to work whenever I was needed rather than stick to a rigid timetable. It also had a lot of key outsourced operations in Asia and Mexico, and that was significant for the types of global incidents you have occur. But due to its size and the way it did business and the fact that it had a lot of technology available to, internally, the primary recovery policies were transfer work to another country, transfer work to working from home, and we worked through the details for every single part of the business to work out what's the best way to keep that going if you couldn't continue to operate in the location you were in. So if you look at the global risks that we faced, we actually invoked our plan several times a year, typically once a month somewhere in the world, and most often in Asia. It was a global program with global standards of doing things that I kept very simple because that worked better. It needed to be very clear what had to happen, who was in charge, whenever and wherever the plan had to be invoked. But it was very much then locally implemented, local teams, and the relationships were critical. And relationships between the technology side of the company, the facilities management, and the business. And the three had to work together seamlessly, despite very different languages, backgrounds, understanding, and perhaps focus on what the key issue was. Now, our key risks that we faced: terrorism, earthquakes, extreme weather, power shortages. Interestingly, that one was tended to be the UK and India, and not so much the rest of the world. Civil unrest and disease outbreaks. So those were the big ones we faced. We had the usual incidents like fires always happen, floods happen everywhere, but there's some risks are more likely than others. Earthquakes not a risk in this country. It is a big risk in other parts of the world. And part of the planning and to work out where we needed to focus on what type of incident, you've got to use external sources of information. So Swiss Re have done, they do many useful reports, and one of their reports is on cities at most risk of natural disaster. Now, a lot of those are terribly obvious. I worked for a Japanese company for many years. And the earthquake risk in Tokyo is very well known, very well understood. It's actually part of what got me interested. At the time, I was a researcher in telecoms technology, so nothing to do with resilience of the business. But I was very interested in the way they built their large towers on ball bearing type mechanisms so that the buildings would flex in earthquakes. And a lot of what we might put in as a resilience measure was built into the way the company operated. It was built into their buildings, it was built into their business. So you would still maybe struggle within a Japanese company to find a head of business continuity because it's part of how they think for how they do business. And I do think we can still learn from that in other places. And then a lot of the other areas of risk are popular offshore and outsourcing locations, India, China, Indonesia, and that needs to be thought about when you actually do offshore and outsource your business. You're not actually offshoring and outsourcing your risks. So, which I've jumped onto the next slide, that map which I've got down there, it shows the earthquake zones, and one of the incidents I do talk about now is earthquakes. But before that, I'll start with talking about Hurricane Wilma. So Nortel had a lot of operations in Florida, and hurricanes are just a part of normal business in Florida. So that side of things was very well rehearsed. We did a lot of exercises. Alistair referred to exercises this morning. I'm a huge fan of doing regular exercises. Get people practicing. They then have patterns of behaviour to fall back on in a major incident, and those patterns of behaviour are really important. They need to know what they're doing without having to work it out, without sometimes having to go to the paper plans. I know that's slight heresy, but if you've documented your plans, you've worked through them in an exercise, you then know what you're doing in a real incident. So these are well-honed plans. And hurricanes can be predicted. So I had somebody in facilities in one of the partner companies, I think it was in JCI, would monitor hurricanes as they were building up, would track the path, see whether it was likely to hit, would track the intensity. We would alert the offices that were likely to be impacted ahead of time. So we've got a couple of days usually, sometimes a little longer, so they know something's coming. And then as part of the plans that were built in that's a variant for that location, because we knew something was coming, we would invoke and transfer work ahead of time. So the target was to have at least half a day of employees going home to secure their own homes, get their families together. So it was a policy to actually try and make that easier for the staff. So that was always transfer work to other locations. We didn't transfer work from home in those circumstances. And we also had our security personnel would have to be barricaded inside the building with about 3 days' worth of food and water. And that was because looting was an issue. And again, you have to treat all of your team as important members. The security staff are critical for a successful business continuity program. They have to be prepared to do that. If you're to help secure your workplace. And so treat them as the professionals and the valued professionals they are. Then after the hurricane and after any major incident, we'd do a number of incident management team calls across the duration of the incident until we were back to normal to track the work that should be going on and the critical work. We didn't track everything. We didn't focus on non-critical work. Part of our plans were to decide what you actually close down, what you stop doing if you've had a major incident. Because if you're trying to spread your resources too thinly, you're not going to succeed terribly well. So we had a very simple ranking system for the work on what had to continue, what would like to continue, and what could actually manage for a while without a great deal of attention. And so on those instant management calls, the hurricanes were a little different. We didn't tend to have many local people. Any local identified primes that could join the call was great. We got the local information, and we always needed the facilities people. But they were supplemented by their global counterparts to track the work that's been transferred, track that everybody's okay, and to work out at what point we were going to start reopening that office and transfer work back. And again, we had a policy of the first day of the office reopening, we wouldn't transfer work back to that location. That would be a day to settle in, to check that the schools were still going to stay open, because if people have sent kids off to school and they suddenly realise they've got a problem with their water, have to send them back. We need to know all of that everyone's ready to kick in and start working as normal as soon as we transferred it back. And we also found that we got a lot of positive feedback from employees, particularly this hurricane, that they knew their jobs were fine, that work would come back to them. They knew they didn't need to worry about their jobs for a few days whilst they got themselves sorted out. And so when they came back in, they were really motivated to get going and continue and get everything running efficiently again. So again, for that type of incident, our success factors, I mean, there was a few, and there's some that come back to time and time again. They'd all been involved in exercises before it hit. So they all knew what their roles were. They knew what their colleagues would be doing. They all knew the work would be transferred out of region, and that we had no critical IT systems that we depended on in region. We had one when I took over that I took the first hurricane as the excuse to get it moved, because as we know, it's hard sometimes to get the business case, to get the business agreement and the business case put together. So I had that ready to go to transfer that as soon as we had the first major incident, so that could be used as the driver to move it and say, right, we really do need to move this now. So back to earthquakes, and this one was a very different type of incident, but the same simple principles for the program, the same fairly simple plans worked as well. Now, this was a major earthquake in the central China back in 2008, and it actually only impacted 7 people. It was a very small sales office, and all of those people we established very quickly were safe. But it also impacted manufacturing. Now, the manufacturing, most of it was done in China. Telecoms equipment comes wrapped in big boxes of steel. You need a lot of steel for your telecoms equipment. You need a lot of components that are also manufactured in China. So any ripple through impact in that supply chain was going to hit us quite quickly. So we had a very difficult scenario in this one, 2 very different areas to track. We had done some simulation exercises in China not too long before, and I was tremendously lucky that just at the timing of those exercises, I'd had a new manufacturing representative join. He'd come along in one of the first couple of weeks wondering quite why he was in this exercise and who this English woman was telling them what to do. About halfway through the exercise, I suddenly saw his face light up because he suddenly got what we were trying to do and why. And he was very focused on manufacturing and supply chain, so this was completely new to him. When this incident hit, he realized that he had to get in there working with all of our key suppliers, constantly checking the supply chain. It wasn't hit initially. We knew there'd be some ripple through impacts. You know when you're dealing with your suppliers that the person who's in there with them checking, is everything okay? I want updates, how's our equipment flow running, will get the greater attention, and they'll get the resources before the company that hasn't thought to go and ask their suppliers. So he knew that he had to be in partnership with them right the way through until the supply chains were back to normal in China. Now that presented some difficulties. He was a Mandarin speaker based in Shanghai, and a lot of the equipment manufacturers where the shortages would start to appear were actually in the south of the country speaking Cantonese. So much of their work was done in English. And I think that's also important to think about as you're outsourcing and offshoring some of this work. Just because it's all done in one country does not mean there's a common language, or that common language will often actually be English. So that all went on for some time and worked really quite smoothly. The 7 people in Chengdu that we hadn't forgotten about were still there. And there was also the impact on the major R&D facility in Beijing. When a major incident like this happens in a country, people are distracted, they're upset. As soon as they realised some of their colleagues were caught up in it, they were even more distracted. And there was a great shortage of getting supplies, relief supplies, to that area. Now, one of my managers based in Australia actually managed to locate 8 tents that he got shipped to Beijing, and we then put out a request to the office, to the entire site. It was quite a large campus site, asking for volunteers to get on a plane and take these through to our colleagues. And there was a huge response. We could just pick whoever we wanted to do. And there was a huge boost in morale and productivity. That wasn't why we did it. We did it because it was the right thing to do to look after our people. But it has that knock-on effect of helping morale and productivity overall. So our key success factors there, again, I come back to the exercise. Time and again, I could tell how well something was going to run based on whether we'd run exercises with that team. And we might have done tremendously different scenarios in the exercise, but the principles remain the same. We had really good site exec. That highest paid person on site was excellent in Beijing, and the facilities support from our facilities partner companies. And that was all run out of Beijing, with me coming in on conference calls, because we did everything by conference call. We were a telecoms company. That's how we worked. But again, it was that keeping people involved, keeping them engaged, keeping the communications out there, so everybody knew what we were doing and why and when. So they knew how things were running. So, different types of incidents, and terrorism has quite an impact on business. It varies considerably by country. Again, if you look for external sources of information, the risk on places like Iraq and Pakistan, Nigeria, Kenya, we know those are all high terrorism risks. We know Europe continues to be a risk. Some of the business continuity work, if we're going back quite a long way, was more advanced in Europe because we had more of a problem with terrorism than other countries. I'm going back quite a way now. And so other countries have had to catch up in the meantime. It is now a truly global issue. I've got a pack that is available that has a link with an analysis of the risks for different cities. Because again, there's some surprising ones, but it depends on how what data you use to define that risk. Bristol actually comes up as a higher risk than London in the particular bit of analysis, and it's because of very small level civil unrest rather than large scale incidents. But a small number of people with primitive explosives, particularly as we saw in Paris, as we saw in Sydney, they can have a significant disruptive impact on the city. If you've got a terrorism incident, you've got police cordons going up and areas of the city that you can no longer go to. As a telecoms manufacturer and supplier, that caused a lot of problems because you can't get engineers through a police cordon very easily. But if you've had critical civil infrastructure damaged, and telephone networks are critical civil infrastructure and they are necessary to keep them going, you may need to get engineers through those police cordons, and that's where you have to get yourself involved in the country's resilience program, in the government run and the local law enforcement and blue light services in resilience forums, so that you know how you get that request put through, that you know what information would need to be provided. So at Nortel, I did know where I'd go to, how I'd get that request into COBRA, as it is in the UK. I knew how I'd get those requests in through North America. Because again, in both the UK and North America, Nortel actually looked after the equipment for 999 calls and 911 calls. And that had to keep going regardless of anything else. So all of that has to be built in. And notice that I mentioned earlier, I came from the technology background. I was used to architecting high availability systems. This isn't what's important in keeping these incidents managed and running. That has to be in the background. You have to know your systems are resilient, but that's an enabler. That's not the key focus once you come to managing an incident. When you come to managing an incident, it's actually a lot more about making sure people understand what they're doing and the relationships that you've built up. Having a major incident in China, when I'd been out to China and got to know the key individuals through the exercises, was one of those factors that helped it run a lot more smoothly. So we'll go to one of, I guess, my first major incident that I had, which I know it's going back 10 years now, which is a surprisingly long way back. But the London bombings back in 2005, and at the time, Nortel had a large managed services presence. By that, I mean we managed customers' networks. We managed either part of it, we managed phone networks for a couple of police forces. We managed the phone network for one of the major UK operators. So when you picked up your fixed line, whether you got a dial tone or not, was partly down to the network that Nortel was managing. And we had about 20 different customers that we managed out of an operations centre in London, and we had a secondary one for some of those systems in Maidenhead in the UK. Now, this one was an interesting incident. It had a different impact to anything else we'd ever seen. Now, it had a mass call event. A mass call event in telecoms terms, it's what you get when you get a phone in for Britain's Got Talent. I find it amazing because I've yet to ring into one of these. It's just passed me by, but the phenomena didn't. Pop Idol was the first one that I encountered, and we found our systems were not managing tremendously well. And at the time, I was architecting the operational systems to keep the phone networks going that we looked after. So, okay, this is a bit interesting. We're getting a huge spike in phone calls for, as it was then, Pop Idol. It's a restricted range of numbers, a restricted time period. You know exactly when those phone calls are going to come in, and you know exactly where they're going to come in. So in some ways, it's not too hard to manage. But I thought, right, this is a chance to make sure ensure our systems can handle a mass call event from any direction, unexpected or expected, and that it can cope with a huge increase in calls. So we'd done that work, and that had taken some time. I do recall having to do a 17-page business case for one of the customers we managed, because in many cases I had to get the customers to pay to upgrade their systems. That was what our operations people used. But we had done that work, we'd done the analysis, and this was the real test to see whether it actually worked. And the systems did, which was lucky, because I couldn't quite claim they weren't my responsibility anymore, even though I'd moved on. And these calls were sustained over hours and hours. I got somebody to pull the records from the switches that actually switched those phone calls, and it was 1,000 times normal work activity on the switch, which doesn't translate exactly into calls, but 1,000 times greater workload on that switch, sustained for hours. So it wasn't a peak for a few minutes, it was sustained. Part of the planning we'd done was with the customers to say, if we have a peak like that, and we have to dump records off these systems quickly, do you want to keep your billing records so you can bill for every call placed, or do you want to be able to place as many calls as possible and not worry about losing the odd billing record? And that was a decision for our customers, not for us to make as a business. Now, they made what I felt was the right call, which is getting the phone calls connected is more important than being able to bill for them. So we did the plans to focus on that, but to also make sure we knew if we had to, we could pull those records off to another location as quickly as possible. In the event we were able to do both, we did keep every billing record, and they were able to bill for every phone call placed, but we managed to keep all of those switches working all of the time. which not all parts of the telecoms network did. And our plans did work particularly well. It was the people, though, as well, and the partnerships. All of that had to move smoothly, work smoothly to enable that to happen. So we had some other problems, which were secondary from a telecoms point of view, but we couldn't do shift change for the 24/7 operations. Now, in part, and it came to the relationships, getting people doing the exercises, understanding how important their role is in the whole incident. A lot of our operations people in London volunteered to do a second shift, so they stayed on. Some of them did do 2 shifts back to back till we could get people transferring to other locations. Different parts of the office, although it's a 24/7 office, shift change happened at different times for different functions. So we had somebody that was monitoring all of that and ringing up people to say, you've got to go to this location, not the London office, for this time. But they weren't doing all those phone calls all at once, because you're waking up shift operators. And if you're waking them up midway through their sleep and you want them to come on board for a very difficult shift, it's important you ring them in time for them to go to the other location, but not so that you wake them up. And all of that needs to work, as well as the technology. And we could get really excited about how well our switches were working and how well our operational systems were working. But tracking those shift changes was one of those bits of work that was critical to actually making sure it happened smoothly. And then the other problem we had was difficulty in moving around London. So again, from a telecoms point of view, you have a lot of men in white vans moving stuff around, and that's happening all of the time. It's largely invisible. It's nearly all men within a very restricted age range as well, doing a lot of this, because they're trained to go and replace those parts. It's not a delivery service. They have to go in and do that. So a part of what we had to think about was to not make any risky changes in other networks that might require someone to go to site. So some work was postponed for a few days if their business could keep going. And it might have been fairly critical work, but if the business could keep going without it, I did not authorise taking that risk of having to send a man in a van to a location he couldn't get to. Safer to keep things running. So all of that has to be tracked all of the time through an incident. And that's where your team of people from the different disciplines are critical, that they understand what their part to play is and keep that reporting back into the main systems. So invoking was also interesting. I'd done a lot of work with the guys in London that manage the telecoms networks on their business continuity plans, so they knew me very well. And again, it comes down to some of the relationships, and getting to know people helps hugely in this. Much as I love an architecture diagram, that's not what gets them ringing up to say, we've got a problem. So the operations centre in London immediately noticed a very unusual pattern of phone calls. And bearing in mind, if you remember from London, initially people were saying there's a power surge on the underground, and there was no information out there on the news for some little while. But within minutes they said there's something very odd going on, because people are phoning from mobile phones all around London to fixed lines, international and other mobiles. So it was an unusual pattern of behaviour. So they alerted the senior manager, and these were the day-to-day operators. That senior manager also was primed to understand the significance of this. We might need to invoke. We'd done lots of exercises, none with this type of scenario. Though actually, we might need to invoke, because this is looking a lot bigger than the news is telling us. And so they contacted me 20 minutes after the first explosion, and we invoked within half an hour of the first explosion and before the bus bomb had gone off. For the next half day, my manager was getting grief from senior managers saying, why have you invoked? No other operators invoked. You've gone too soon. And so he was shielding us from that, because he felt, no, we had made the right call to set in play our plans. And that how quickly you can react is important. And then from when we invoked, we followed the process. And those phone calls, for me, it was illustrated. My mother rang me up. Now, I was working at home. I live near Henley on Thames. It's a reasonable way from London bombings. She phoned me up to check I was okay. She was giving me an update on my various siblings. And it's like, Mum, I am actually really busy now. I'm going to have to put the phone down on you. But those sorts of phone calls are important to people. So I knew what we were doing in keeping those phone networks going. It was important to people that they could contact their friends, their relatives, and just check they're okay. And as I say, we had some quite complex plans that were for that business. We were focusing very much on the critical civil infrastructure. I had a training team that had a number of people coming in via London from customers to come to training in Maidenhead, and they had their plans which they followed largely without any intervention from the larger team to track all of their people coming in for training courses, make sure they were okay, find them alternative accommodation. They'd worked out that plan, they just followed it. They didn't need supervision to do that, and it was a great comfort to know that some of those other plans were just running because we'd rehearsed them as well, and we could focus on the most critical. And again, I mean, the scenario exercises come back again and again as being important, and because this was a very critical team that had to react very quickly, that relationship building, the working closely with facilities, so they understood what we did in those locations, understood what support we'd need, and how that might differ to the rest of the business. Because Nortel was a funny business. It had very different aspects where we might be thinking within the next 5 minutes for some parts of the business and the next 10 years for others. And so it is that knowledge. So I come on to another explosion, because terrorism anywhere. Pakistan in 2008, and this was, it was at a weekend, but it wasn't in Pakistan. For me, it had particular resonance. I'm from a very multicultural family, and one of my cousins was getting married that day, and her father's from Pakistan, and we had a lot of guests at the wedding from Pakistan, so it was kind of, initially I thought this is very weird getting this phone call to say, do we invoke? But there's a very large truck explosion which you remember. In the pack that we can make available afterwards, there's a link to a BBC News website which actually shows the Nortel offices, because they were right beside the Marriott Hotel, as were a number of other offices. It was a business area right beside the hotel, which it is in many countries. You have hotels where your businesses are for your travellers. On that, there's some of the slides from the actual hotel. On this picture, that's the damage from the Nortel office. Now, we were tremendously lucky that although it was a work day, it was timed to go off after people were breaking the Ramadan fast. And so there were no employees in the office. Again, for the wedding I was with, to respect those that were observing Ramadan, we were different times, so we were waiting to eat until after sunset as well, because it was a combination Irish, Maltese, Pakistani wedding, so it's a few different cultures to try and mix in that and have working smoothly. Now, Pakistan was quite a major country for Nortel. Interestingly, when I worked at Deutsche Bank, Pakistan was a major country for business for Deutsche Bank as well. So it may seem not so relevant for some sectors, but there are sectors where it's big business there. Majority of that work is building out networks. Now, that has the advantage that a lot of that's remote, and it's project management and moving of equipment, but it was out across the country. So again, we kicked off crisis management and business continuity straight away. I handed over to my alternate for that in the immediate aftermath, because I felt it was too difficult to do that straight from a wedding with a number of relatives who might also have people in the city. And then, We'd done a lot of work over the previous 2 years with the Pakistan in-country team, because we knew it was a country where we would have a problem. We didn't know when, we didn't know what, but we did know we would have problems. So we'd built up that relationship again between the business, between the IT organisation, between the facilities management. We had a very high ability to transfer to remote working, so that's what we did. Our equipment, and we were kind of pleased about that, it was still working inside the building. You couldn't get into the building, although I did realise afterwards they'd gone rather too far in the building. I got about 40, 50 photos, and somebody had gone further than they should have done to get me photos of the damage. But the previous week I was working with some colleagues in America who wanted to transfer business, offshore it, outsource it to one location only in a risky part of the world, not too far from this. So on the Monday, I'd sent him, I think I'd sent them the top and the bottom photo to say, this is what we've got to plan for. If we're going to put work in one location, this is the risk. And he said, oh, but that's not a Nortel office. So that's where I realised quite how many photos I went. And there was only one with the logo. So I found the one with the logo and sent it back and said, yes, it is. And that brought it home to them in a way that all my talking for the previous few months hadn't, that they really couldn't put critical work in a single location, and especially not in a risky part of the world. Something we did find, though, as well, rents went up dramatically now because Nortel had a lot of locations and that ability to work remotely. We didn't use external workplace continuity. It is somewhere where it would really have been useful in that circumstance, because we did need to continue with a small office. But the nature of the work meant we didn't need to continue with a large office. So we were able to get another office at not too dramatic increase in costs, but it was much smaller than we'd had before. Again, the success factors there, the ability to work from home, the global team relationship with local management. I mean, that was fundamental, and using the local team supported by the global team. So switch tack slightly to the unexpected, and this one is one of my favourite incidents, because in all of the scenarios I'd worked out, I would never have actually put a Bollywood star death as business impacting. Major following in Bangalore, so there was 60,000 fans took to the streets because the government decided they would move his body, and there was protests. Large-scale rioting. Again, in the pack that we can make available, there's a link to some of the news reports on it. 8 people died in the rioting, including policemen, 2 days national mourning. Because of that civil unrest, the rioters started impacting the technology companies, American companies first, and then the homegrown companies like Wipro, TCS and others. And so they had to close down. They had no option but to close those sites for the duration of the rioting to keep people safe. So for Nortel, that affected R&D in Canada and Ireland, and it affected call centre operations in Australia. So customers ringing in to get new parts, say I've got a fault. Now that part of it we could transfer to another supplier. Our supplier went down. They'd had business continuity plans. We'd reviewed them. They still couldn't keep their office open in these circumstances, so we had a secondary plan ourselves from the business to transfer those to Canada. And that had been worked out, and that worked well. So again, it's knowing you've got those plans, knowing you can transfer work wherever needed, knowing what you can stop, knowing what needs to keep going. It's all important. And then I'm almost at the end. The other unexpected, but it wasn't really unexpected, we'd done a lot of work for bird flu, and bird flu worried us because I mentioned the demographic, the young men in vans. A lot of the workforce installing telecoms networks are young, fairly fit men in the 20 to 30 age range. Bird flu had the greatest mortality rate for that demographic, so we knew we had a potential problem if there was a bird flu outbreak, because that would have a major impact. Someone like myself that's a little over, more than a few years over that age range, female. It didn't have didn't have the same mortality impact. So we'd done the work, but Mexico had a lot of the business's critical customer operations. It was also the most senior man on site was a salesman, and so he wasn't hugely comfortable running the incident. Again, we'd done the work ahead of time, had those relationships, and so he asked for me to run the local incident management by conference call. And because he'd asked and I had that support, it was very easy to go from that point, although it had to be done in English at that point, because I do not speak Spanish. But we'd had the relationship there that he trusted I would keep the focus on his business, and rather than taking a wholly global role, that I knew what they did, knew what was important. And so over a few days, we could move 98% of our people for the swine flu outbreak. The Mexican government put major restrictions in place on movement. And so a lot of the other businesses had about 50% drop-off. But because we'd already rehearsed for this, we'd done the planning, we actually kept almost all of the work going exactly as it necessary, without a great deal having to go out of country. So the last one, unfortunately, that we didn't recover from. Nortel went into administration with $500 million in the bank. And for anyone who was familiar, it had an accounting scandal that was what we'd refer to as a smouldering crisis for many, many years beforehand. But the senior execs were not keen on recognising that as a crisis, and we'd had several changes of CEO as a result of that accounting scandal. And it was the emphasis was on trying to ensure everything was okay. And then as part of the global program, I had a business risk forum that once a year we had representatives from every part of the business, and we would brainstorm what's the biggest risk. This is where bird flu had come out as being a particular concern for our type of business, where we'd worked on a lot of other areas and put in place something that would work globally and locally. And about 18 months before it went into administration, we'd actually identified that the greatest risk, forget the rest, access to credit was going to be the problem. And that was a little before the banking crisis hit. So banking crisis hit, access to credit, and they had their other smouldering crisis that was unacknowledged was the underfunding of the pension funds. So there was a huge hole in the pension funds in both the States and in the UK. A change to how access to credit risk was assessed meant that suddenly Nortel was a lot more risky from a credit point of view than it had been before because of those holes. So 2 smouldering crises led to this. Unfortunately, the senior execs would not invoke crisis management. The COO said, we're not in crisis. They were in a state of denial about the state of that this was a crisis. They thought they could manage it as business as usual. Now, as soon as the COO said we are not in crisis, the senior business continuity team, we knew that was it, game over for the company. It was only a question of how long it would take to go down. And so we recognised at that point, because if you do not recognise you have a problem and do not invoke your process and your plans to manage that in a different way to business as usual, you will go under. Part of what would have stopped him using the corporate jet so overtly, because employees found where they could get a site that they could track all of his trips. And so that was being passed around employees. Okay, they're laying us off with no notice and no severance, but he's still flying, and you could actually pull it up and see it on a display where he was flying to. That is part of what your crisis management has to stop. We had another of my favourite incidents, which again we've got the link, but the French employees decided they weren't happy with getting the very generous severance they had to get in France, and there was no option, or corporate officers would be imprisoned. It was somewhat different in the UK, and so they decided they'd blow up the site. And I got one of those phone calls. I was actually shopping in my lunchtime for dinner that night when I got a phone call saying the French employees are threatening to blow up the site. And the France office was also the hub for all of our internal network across Europe. So it was the hub. Now, I'd known if there was a place that in Europe that was going to be a problem and kick off, it would be France. So for the previous few months, I'd been working with the IT and the telecoms people to make sure we could isolate that site, that we could reroute everything so that we were no longer dependent on that site. And again, an excellent facilities manager who I'd met a number of times, done a number of exercises out there. And so when he rang me to tell me about this, say, right, is everybody off site? And he said, everyone except me, right, you get yourself off site. Phone call into IT, let's isolate that, and then I finished shopping for dinner. With the first thought when the call came in was, I love my job, because I knew we had the plans to cope with that. It might, under normal circumstances, been rung up to say they want to blow up the office. Is a little concerning. It was, I love my job because we'd anticipated, we'd planned for, we knew it would work. I also knew it was highly unlikely they actually would blow up the office, but we had everybody safe just in case. So the safety came first, and then the customers were not going to be impacted by it going up. And so then, just to summarise, global business, you can never really be quite sure what's going to hit. And that was one of the things I loved about that sort of job, because you just did not know what that next phone call was going to be. A lot of the time was the preparation in between, but, and again for global, it had to be a global programme, but local plans, and that relationship building had to happen all of the time. And again, facilities, the IT side and the business all working together. Had to understand what part of the business is most important in each location. If your business is very different places, what do you need to keep going, what do you not? I've said that before, and that's part of what do you not need to continue is just as important. The exercise programme proved itself time and again. Use of technology, and I love technology. Use of technology was important, but not as key as some of the other areas. But conventional business continuity is not enough. I need to really think about the board and senior management have to understand their part to play, and they didn't. And you need to have those senior levels of authority and recognise and manage smouldering crises, and switch to thinking about operational resilience rather than business continuity. So that's the end of mine. I think anyone has.
We all found that a very surprising presentation in some of the facts you shared, and especially for people who live in Somerset like Ben and I, they know that Bristol is an anarchist hotspot, and his property value's probably just gone down now. So, any questions for Patricia?
It surprised me as well, having worked in Bristol for a client.
Some of the people in Bristol, it doesn't surprise me.
Some of them are a little dodgy, aren't they?
Hi, Patricia, it's Steve Dawes.
Hi, Steve.
Thank you. Given your experiences of these disasters, how would you respond to a comment someone made recently about business continuity plans and their involvement in incidents when they said, we never ever once reached for a document? Now, I'll qualify that by saying he wasn't saying just wing it, but it just poses a question mark over some of the content I think we produce that we think will help us in an incident.
I would actually agree with that. I think people very rarely reach for that document. And that is why the exercise programs, where you make them sit through and work through the document, and so they understand what's in that, they've rehearsed it. Whilst writing the document, they've had to think about what strategies they'd use, what risks they faced, and work through all of that. The exercise tests that document, it rehearses the people, and it also means they know what is in there, but they should ideally be well enough rehearsed that when they don't pick up the document, they know what to do. Now, I've been doing a lot of technology resilience exercises with a client, and I make these guys, I go into the office and make them come into the office to do this, although the reality is they'd probably be doing it remotely in a real incident. And I make them pull up their plan on one of those screens to also try and get them used to using the document and used to the value, what is in there that they will go and look up. Now, I'm fairly confident that when they have to use one of those documents, they will start working through before they pull it up. But I'm hoping that they will remember, actually, there is that tricky bit that I need to think about the order here and pull up the document. But they have to have practiced using it and know what's in there to pull it up.
Okay. Anyone?
Standard silence.
Yeah, Patricia, thank you very much. Some fascinating case studies there. Thank you for sharing them with us. You mentioned one of the key risks, particularly here in the UK, is power shortage. With the looming energy problem, and some would call it a crisis even, where people are predicting brownouts and blackouts, what advice would you be giving to FMs and facilities teams now about building resilience into their plans for the future?
I mean, some of that is simple, and the power shortage, the way it also impacts, we've had fuel crises and not been able to get hold of petrol and diesel. And part of it is facilities managers need to understand who gets priority in the UK in event of an incident. And the priorities are very clearly laid out in the network of government resilience forums. And I'm a member of the Thames Valley one. They've not quite pushed me out yet. I used to represent it from the telecoms point of view, and I'm still included in their communications very kindly. But it is run through the Resilience Forum, gives priority. So obviously police, fire service, ambulance service get priority. But government offices, council offices, social services are all going to get access to fuel before a business. And that side of it slightly worries me. You've got to look after people, but a social worker going out to do their regular visits should not be a higher priority than business. But today it is in the UK government strategy. And so we have to work with that. So you have to have reserves of fuel. You have to know, and again, it comes back to one of the points I've made before, what are you going to turn off? So if you're trying to keep your business going, if you're trying to keep your data center going, often in a data center there's some critical systems and there's some systems that frankly you can live without. Turn those off, reduce the power usage and the heat output. So know what you're going to turn off in your data center to conserve what power you've got, what access you've got. So your facilities people manage your generators. Generator testing has to keep happening. It's tedious, but every so often they go wrong, and testing increases your chances. If you're a big organisation, you should have relationships with generator suppliers. Now, I do remember many years ago, I'd got a call. I was actually at my godson's birthday party, and there'd been a major storms in the Caribbean. A lot of equipment had been blown away and generators, and I was being asked, because I was working for an American organisation, North American, it was a customer wanting access to generators and seeing whether I could help. Now actually I could, and it was one of those, this sort of multicultural environment we live in the UK. Much of the party were from the West Indies. His godfather was, a lot of the other guests were, so they let me off going off and working in a corner for a while to find who our contacts were with generator supplies and fuel supplies to help out our customer in that case, because we were not terribly badly hit, but they had a major foothold in the Caribbean. And again, getting the phones up and working was our business, so helping them get their phone network up and working again was important. But it's those relationships, both formal and informal. So your generator suppliers, have the contracts, know you're a priority, keep a good relationship with them. This is not the place to start driving down to the lowest possible price, because the relationship's important too. And I think that's another part that gets overlooked for resilience and business continuity. that relationship may be more important than getting that slight reduction in price. And you've got to weigh that up with your procurement people and make sure they understand the impact of their work on the resilience of your company.
Questions today, but never mind. In your talk earlier, you mentioned about the ease of being able to move to other locations, but there's an awful lot of businesses out there that can't move. So, for example, one of my clients at the moment is the Delphont Macintosh Theatre Group. They've been running on generators for the last month from the cable fire. So what are your thoughts on when you physically can't move, for example, like a manufacturing facility?
Yeah, and manufacturing was a worry actually for Nortel because manufacturing was big, and one of our critical components was manufactured in California with a supplier that refused to admit to the risk of earthquakes. So your strategies, I mean, if you truly cannot remain in place, you have to go elsewhere, either move the work or move the people. And for a theatre company, again, you think about partnerships. If you pre-plan this, is there another company where you could share some facilities? And think about that. Could you, and again, you have to do this ahead of time and have some of those discussions. If they're running off generators, then they understand how important their generators are if you truly can't stay in place. But if that had been destroyed by fire, their generators would not be of great deal use to them, so they'd need an alternate location. So you have to know where else you could go.